The origins of the Uyghurs are hard to establish with certainty, because ancient sources weren't always clear in how they identified and described steppe tribes. The first known mention of the Uyghurs as a distinct group comes from a 6th century Chinese history, the Wei Shu. It claims that the Uyghurs descended from the Xiongnu and were known in that period as the Gaoche, meaning high cart people. At the time, they were part of a larger confederation called the Tiela, which numbered around 10,000. Over time, the Gaoche split into 2 groups, the An Uyghur and the Tokuz Oghuz. An Uyghur remained in the Orkhon and Selenge river valleys, while the other, the Tokuz Oghuz, moved southwest toward the Altai region near the Tian Shan Mountains. These 2 regions later became the heartlands of separate Uyghur states. Despite their emerging identity, the Uyghurs were still under the rule of the dominant Turkic Khaganate, which controlled much of the steppe. By the mid-7th century, the Turk Khaganate was falling apart, partly because it had split into eastern and western factions. The Uyghurs took advantage of this instability and started forging their own relationships with the Tang dynasty. The Chinese, always looking to keep steppe tribes divided, granted military titles to Uyghur leaders to encourage rivalries. Around this time, a powerful Uyghur clan, the Yaglakar, rose to prominence, and Uyghur became firmly established as their political identity. One of their early leaders, Pusa, was a skilled warrior who defeated a Turk army of around 100,000. He then switched sides and pledged loyalty to the Tang emperor, who rewarded him with titles and gifts. His successor, Tumidu, took the ancient Turk imperial title Khagan in 640. Unfortunately, for the next several decades, historical records on the Uyghurs are sparse, although we do know of a woman named Bilidu who ruled from 664 to 680. A major challenge in tracking their early history is that some sources continued to lump them in with the larger Tiela Confederation. By the late 7th century, the Eastern Turk Khaganate had regained its strength, and the Uyghurs were once again under their control. However, they were never fully loyal and rebelled in 717. That attempt failed, but in 744, they got another chance when the Tang emperor sent an envoy, urging them to unite with 2 other Turkic tribes, the Karluks and the Bashmil, who were also fed up with Turk rule. Together, they crushed their Turk overlords. To demonstrate his newfound power, the Uyghur Khagan sent the severed head of the defeated Turk leader to the Tang court, marking the official end of the Turk steppe empire. But the alliance between the Uyghurs, Karluks, and Bashmil didn't last long. As soon as the rebellion was over, the Uyghurs turned on the Bashmil and also persuaded the Karluks to join them in wiping them out. Then, once the Bashmil were defeated, the Uyghurs turned against the Karluks. With both rivals subdued, the Uyghur leader Gyulapilluo declared the founding of a new Uyghur state, structured similarly to that of the old Turk Khaganate. He took the royal title Kutlug Bilge Kol Khagan and became the first ruler of the Uyghur Khaganate, and his Yaglakar clan became the new royal family. The rest of his reign was spent consolidating power and expanding Uyghur control over all the lands once ruled by the Eastern Turks. Gyulapilluo's reign was short-lived. He died in 747, leaving the empire in the hands of his son Bilge Kol Khagan, known in Chinese records as Moyencho. Unlike his father, who had focused on internal consolidation, Moyencho was aggressive and ambitious. He tightened his grip over the Karluks and Bashmils, ensuring they remained under Uyghur control. But his biggest move came in 755, when China's Tang dynasty fell into turmoil. A devastating rebellion, led by a powerful general named Lushan, had erupted across the empire. The Tang emperor, desperate for help, turned to the Uyghurs. Moyencho saw an opportunity and sent Uyghur forces to support the Chinese. In return, the Tang granted the Uyghurs immense political leverage, allowing them to dictate terms to the Chinese court. Though the rebellion was eventually crushed, China never fully recovered, and for years, the Tang relied on Uyghur military support to maintain control. Moyencho's death in 759 was sort of a turning point. His second son Mao Yi took the throne under the title Tangri Khagan, and under his rule, the Uyghur Empire reached its peak. Like his father, he maintained the alliance with China and even personally led troops to aid the Tang in 762. However, his time in China had a lasting impact on him. He converted to Manichaeism, a religious movement from Persia that blended elements of Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Buddhism. Mao Yi Khagan's conversion wasn't just a personal choice. Instead, it reshaped the entire Uyghur Empire. Manichaean priests gained influence at court, and many of them were Sogdian merchants who had fled persecution in Persia. Over time, these Sogdians became key advisors to the Khagan, and their presence stirred resentment among traditionalist Uyghurs. This tension reached a breaking point in 779. When Maoyi's Sogdian advisors urged him to invade China, hoping to exploit the recent death of the Tang emperor, his cousin and chief minister, Tun Buga, strongly objected. But Maoyi ignored him. Seeing no other way to stop the invasion, Tun Buga staged a coup and assassinated the Khagan and ordering the execution of many Sogdian officials. He then took the throne himself and adopted the title Alp Kutlug Bilga Khagan. Under his rule, the empire took a sharp turn. He distanced the Uyghurs from Manichaean influences, cracked down on Sogdian power, and pursued a more cooperative relationship with China. However, this political shift created new enemies within the empire, which led to instability in the years to come. After Tun Buga's death in 789, Manichaean and Sogdian influence returned, but the empire was no longer as strong as before. Power began slipping from the ruling clan into the hands of high-ranking military officials. One of these officials, known as Elogasi, became the real decision-maker while acting as a regent for a young Khagan. The empire's decline became evident in 790, when Uyghur forces suffered humiliating defeats while trying to defend Beshbalik, a key outpost in western China, from Tibetan invaders. The failure to protect their territories weakened their standing, both at home and abroad. In 795, the Khagan died without an heir, and Elogasi took the throne himself. He belonged to the Adiz clan, but adopted the prestigious Yaglakar surname to legitimize his rule. Chinese records describe him as a skilled debater and a formidable warrior who commanded great respect. Even before becoming Khagan, he had managed to reclaim Peiting from the Tibetans in 791 to 792, and revive the Uyghur power for a very brief period of time. But despite his efforts, the empire was already crumbling. The final blow came in the late 830s. A devastating winter in 839 wiped out much of the Uyghurs' livestock and dealt a severe blow to their economy. At the same time, the Kyrgyz, a rising power in the north, became increasingly aggressive. In 840, a rebellious Uyghur nobles invited the Kyrgyz to attack. The invasion was swift and brutal. The Kyrgyz army stormed the capital, killed the Khagan, and shattered Uyghur rule. With their empire in ruins, the surviving Uyghurs scattered, and this marked the end of their dominance in Mongolia. The collapse of the Uyghur steppe empire set off a chain reaction across Central and East Asia. The Kyrgyz, who took over their territory, never built an empire of their own. Meanwhile, Tibet's once powerful state quickly unraveled, and even Tang China, after struggling for a while, finally fell apart in 907. But the Uyghurs didn't vanish with their empire. Instead, they moved south and founded two new states, one in present-day Gansu and another in the Tarim Basin. Unfortunately, historical records about their migration and early years in these new lands are scarce. However, one thing is clear. The Uyghurs who settled in the Tarim Basin carried forward the legacy of their ancestors from Karabalgasin. One group of Uyghurs moved into Gansu, maintaining close ties with the Tang court until its fall. Even after Tang's collapse, they remained politically relevant and often secured imperial titles from various Chinese successor states. In 911, a Uyghur leader named Renmei captured Dunhuang. It was an important trade hub. He later sent envoys to the later Liang and later Tang dynasties, and received a prestigious imperial title from the later Tang emperor in 924. Over time, 6 more Uyghur rulers in Ganzhou were recognized with similar honors. But the Ganzhou Uyghurs didn't just engage with the Chinese. They also maintained relations with the Khitan Liao dynasty, the first semi-nomadic empire to rule northern China after Tang's fall. Between 913 and 1053, multiple tributary missions took place between Ganzhou and Liao. Even after being annexed by the Tanguts in 1028, the Uyghurs continued their diplomatic ties with later Chinese and nomadic states, including the Jurchen Jin dynasty and Song China. However, Song China's main focus wasn't the Ganzhou Uyghurs. It was the much larger Uyghur kingdom in the Tarim Basin. The most notable interaction between the two was in 982, when a Song envoy named Wang Yende visited the Uyghur cities of Kocho and Beshbalik, and left behind a fascinating record of their culture and daily life. Unlike their counterparts in Gansu, the Uyghurs in the Tarim Basin built a kingdom that would last for centuries. Led by an aristocrat named Mongli, also known as Menglik Tejen, about 15 Uyghur tribes migrated south around 840 and settled in Kutcha, a major oasis city along the Silk Road. From there, Mongli expanded Uyghur rule by pushing out Tibetan forces and securing key locations like Dunhuang, Hami, and Turfan. By 857, the Tang Emperor recognized Mongli's power and granted him an imperial title. In 866, the Uyghurs captured Gaochang and made it their winter capital. Meanwhile, Beshbalak remained their primary stronghold until 1270. The Tarim Basin was different from the open steppe where the Uyghurs had once thrived. It was a settled and multicultural region, home to various peoples like Tocharian, Sogdians, Chinese, and other Turkic tribes. Buddhism dominated the area, but other religions including Zoroastrianism, Nestorian Christianity, Islam, and shamanism also flourished. The Uyghurs, who had been Manichaeans during their empire days, continued practicing Manichaeism for some time. However, by the late 10th century, most of their ruling elite had converted to Buddhism. This shift was likely political as well as spiritual. Aligning with Buddhism helped solidify their rule over the Buddhist population of the Tarim Basin, and provided a buffer against the rising Muslim Karakhanids to the west. One lasting impact of this conversion was the creation of a vast Uyghur Buddhist literary tradition. They adopted a new writing system, replacing their old Turkic runes with an adapted script suited for their growing administration. Monasteries flourished, with the Song envoy Wang Yende reporting the presence of 50 Buddhist temples in Gaochang alone. The Uyghur Empire was primarily composed of 9 Turkic tribes, collectively known as the Tokuz Oghuz or 9 surnames. These included the Uyghurs, Buku, Kun, Bayerku, and Tangra, alongside 4 others, Suchi, Chipai, Apusu, and Kuluanwuku, who gained equal status around 742. The Apusu originated as a subtribe of the Suchi, while the Kuluanwuku was formed from the merging of 2 groups. Despite changes over time, Chinese records as late as 808 still referred to the Uyghur ruler as Khagan of the 9 surnames, suggesting the confederation remained politically significant, even if not strictly ethnically defined. By 744, the ruling tribe was the Uyghurs, divided into 10 clans known as the An Uyghur. The dominant Yaglakar clan controlled the empire until 795, when a second dynasty emerged. Like the 9 surnames, the An Uyghur designation was fluid, eventually becoming more political than ethnic. The Uyghurs classified themselves as part of the larger Tilu tribal group in Chinese records, but their empire also included subject peoples. Among the earliest subjugated groups were the Bashmil and a branch of the Karluk, who initially lived around Beshbalak and between Lake Balkhash and Beshbalak respectively. Regarded as inferior by the Uyghurs, these tribes were often placed in the most dangerous frontline positions in battle. Over time, many Karluks were absorbed into the empire. Records such as the Shinusu inscription describe wars against the Bashmil and Karluk under Moyencho, while Chinese sources from around 789 confirm that 3 Karluk tribes were under Uyghur rule. However, after losing Beshbalak to the Tibetans in 790, the Uyghurs also lost control over these tribes, though they later reclaimed the region. Other significant groups in the Uyghur Empire included remnants of earlier Turkic groups that once ruled Mongolia, Sogdians, and a notable Chinese presence. Several Uyghur Khagans married Chinese princesses, and Chinese settlers were recorded in Karabalgasin. Some were given official titles, such as a Chinese man from the Lu family, who was adopted into the Yaglakar clan in 792. Chinese and Sogdians were also tasked with building Baybalak, a city along the Selenga River, likely serving as supervisors rather than laborers. The Uyghur Empire's territory was extensive. In 745, a Chinese source described it as stretching from the Shiwei lands in the east to the Altai Mountains in the west, covering much of the former Xiongnu territory. Though somewhat vague, this suggests a vast domain. However, Uyghur control weakened with the loss of Beshbalak, and by the late 8th century, the Karluk had seized the Fotu Valley, near the sacred Otukan Mountain and dangerously close to Karabalgasin. Despite setbacks, the Second Uyghur dynasty managed to reclaim and expand its holdings, reaching as far west as Fergana. The empire's political and military operations centered on Karabalgasin, where the Khagan's court determined policies. Uyghur administration retained many Turkic structures. A Chinese record from 647 notes that the Uyghur Khagan established official positions similar to those of the earlier Turks. Though functions remained largely unchanged, some Chinese titles such as Tutuk, from Tutu, were adopted. Among the Uyghurs, the Tutuk were tribal leaders, one for each of the 9 major Tokas Oghuz tribes, plus the Karluk and Bashmil. They played key roles in governance, tax collection, and military affairs, maintaining influence both at court and within their tribes. Succession among the Uyghur Khagans generally followed a father-to-son pattern, unlike many Turkic dynasties. The Old Tang history records that when Moyencho Khagan died in 759, his younger son Maoyu succeeded him only because the elder son had already died. However, this tradition was disrupted by Tun Buga, who seized the throne in a coup. His son briefly succeeded him in 789, but was killed the following year by his younger brother, sparking a rebellion in favor of the murdered Khagan's son. Despite internal conflicts, the principle of primogeniture remained influential, even as later rulers sometimes deviated from it. While power largely remained with the ruling family, ministers from outside the Uyghur lineage also played a role. The founder of the Second Dynasty, for example, was originally a court minister. The influential chief minister El Ogasi served under multiple Khagans despite apparently not being related to them. Additionally, the Tutuk of various tribes likely came from their respective groups rather than the ruling clan. A crucial non-Turkic group in Uyghur politics was the Sogdians, most of whom were Manichaeans. Their influence grew significantly after Maoyu Khagan adopted Manichaeism. Even under Tun Buga, who executed Maoyu for following anti-Chinese Sogdian advice, Sogdian officials remained. By the early 9th century, their power became more pronounced. In 807, the first Uyghur embassy to include Manichaeans arrived in the Tang capital, and subsequent missions frequently featured Manichaean representatives. The New Tang history notes that by 813, Sogdians occupied high-ranking positions in the Uyghur administration. The religious affiliations of the Uyghur Khagans played a crucial role in shaping their political life, particularly during the period from 744 to 840, when they embraced Manichaeism. No account of Uyghur history is complete without considering this adoption, as it became one of the most striking aspects of their rule. Manichaeism, founded by the Persian prophet Mani, was built on a dualistic worldview. Mani proposed 2 opposing principles: light that is good, and darkness that is evil. According to his teachings, the human soul was divine in nature, but the physical body was an impediment, aligning with the forces of darkness. To escape suffering, individuals had to detach themselves as much as possible from the material world. Mani divided time into 3 phases. In the first, spirit and matter were separate. In the second, they were intertwined, with humans embodying this mixture. And in the third, good and evil would be permanently divided again. By resisting materialism, one could accelerate the arrival of this final purification. Manichaeism structured society into 2 groups: the elect, consisting of the clergy who followed strict ascetic practices, including celibacy, fasting, and abstinence from meat and alcohol, and the auditors or lay followers who were encouraged to be generous and abstemious, but were allowed to marry and eat normally. A devoted auditor could, in a future reincarnation, be elevated to the rank of the elect. Ultimately, the faithful would reside in a realm of absolute light, while those who failed in their spiritual struggle would be condemned to eternal darkness. As a missionary religion, Manichaeism spread widely across Eurasia. By the 7th century, it had followers in the Byzantine Empire and medieval Europe. It also reached China, where its presence was first documented in 694, when a high-ranking Manichaean cleric arrived at the imperial court. In 719, another dignitary, a mushi, that is bishop, gained favor with the Tang Emperor Xuanzong, who even authorized the construction of a temple for him in Chang'an. However, in 732, the emperor reversed his stance, denouncing Manichaeism as a deceptive doctrine masquerading as Buddhism. Despite this condemnation, foreigners in China were still permitted to practice the religion, a policy that would prove significant for the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs of the Empire period underwent rapid socioeconomic and cultural change. Traditionally, they had been a nomadic people, relying on livestock and moving seasonally for grazing. By the mid-8th century, however, they had started settling in towns and adopting agriculture, likely influenced by both Chinese and Sogdian traditions. Archaeological evidence, such as millstones and irrigation canals, supports the idea that farming, particularly millet cultivation, became increasingly significant. Despite these changes, the Uyghurs' economy remained deeply rooted in animal husbandry. Sheep were the most economically valuable livestock, providing wool for tents, meat, milk, and even fuel. Horses were essential for trade, transport, and military purposes, while oxen and camels played supporting roles. Even as urbanization progressed, meat consumption remained a dietary staple, and official records suggest a high demand for livestock. Urbanization became more pronounced with the construction of cities like Karabalgasin and Baybalik around 757. Karabalgasin in particular grew into a major political and economic center with markets, trades, and a sizable garrison. Trade, particularly with China, was central to Uyghur prosperity. Following their military assistance to the Tang dynasty during the Lushan Rebellion, they established a lucrative horse-for-silk trade, exchanging thousands of horses annually for vast quantities of silk. This trade heavily favored the Uyghurs, and in turn frustrated the Chinese court. Additionally, Uyghur merchants and moneylenders became influential within China, and they accumulated wealth and property despite resistance from the Tang government. Transportation and communication relied on horses and camels, with organized relay stations facilitating movement. Despite urbanization, many Uyghurs continued to live in tents, even in cities. The Uyghur Khagan's golden tent stood as a mark of imperial rule, carrying forward the traditions of their nomadic past even as their state became more structured. Several factors drove Uyghur societal transformation, including the demands of empire administration, economic diversification, and foreign influences. While Chinese political structures played a role, the Uyghurs favored Sogdian culture, and hence they integrated its administrative systems, trade practices, and religious ideas. These influences collectively contributed to the evolution of the Uyghur Empire from a steppe confederation into a more complex, semi-urbanized civilization. By the 12th century, a new power emerged in Central Asia, the Karakitai, descendants of the Khitan Liao dynasty. After the Liao were defeated by the Jurchens in 1125, a Khitan prince named Yeludashi refused to surrender. Instead, he fled west and established a new state in Balasagun, using Chinese and Liao administrative structures. At first, the Karakitai allowed the Uyghurs to govern themselves, asking only for annual tribute payments. But as time passed, tensions grew. By the late 12th century, the Karakitai demanded higher tribute and even stationed an overseer in the Uyghur capital. In 1209, when the Karakitai sent a particularly ruthless representative, the Uyghur ruler Barchik Artejin had him assassinated. This bold move would set the stage for yet another major shift in Uyghur history, one that would bring them into the orbit of an even greater power, the Mongols.